Hello and welcome to Restoration DIY, and whether you're new or returning, it's great to have you here and I hope you enjoy the video. In this episode I make a lidded bowl from two segmental rings cast into epoxy resin. So without further ado, let's get into it. You join me whilst I'm cutting the ash into segments. The first 18 pieces are for the upper ring. The saw is set to a 10-degree angle and these pieces measure 43mm on the long side to give a finished diameter of around 230mm. The second set of segments for the lower ring measure 32mm on the long side to give a finished diameter of 190mm. With all the segments cut, I then had to sand each one to remove the scraggy bits, and by way of an experiment, I didn't run the two lengths of wood through the joint of thicknesser. I wanted to see how the rings would turn out using rough sawn timber, and the results were okay, but I don't think I'll do it like this again. Using square planed material is definitely the way to go. Next was the glue up. In batches of 6 I applied a liberal amount of Type Bond 2 to one side of each segment. And as ever, I can't stress how much you need to put on. This is all end grain, and as you'll see later, it soaks up a surprising amount of glue, making it very easy to get an unbonded joint. With all 18 segments assembled, I used a hose clamp to apply even pressure and hold everything nice and tight. I'll just show one ring being glued up, the other was done in exactly the same way, then set aside and left overnight for the glue to cure. It's the next day and the rings look good. The glue has cured and the joints look nice and tight. So I removed the clamps and ran each ring through the drum sander. These had to be passed through the sander many more times than they usually do. This is because I didn't plane the wood beforehand. So rather than the usual half a dozen passes for each side, this was more than double. Apart from setting up an additional machine, I don't think I saved any time. Another reason to prepare things properly next time. The smaller ring would form the base, and it was slightly too big to fit into the casting bucket. So I fixed it to the lathe in the coal jaws so I could turn it down to size. And also I had to clean up the centre, as this would be filled with resin and visible in the finished piece. I marked a 180mm circle. I wanted a tightish fit in the bucket, and I knew the dimension from before, so I didn't have to double check it. After that, I set to with a parting tool removing the excess material. I could only go so far, then I had to turn the workpiece around to clear the rubber buttons on the jaws. And with the last bit removed, I sanded the centre with 80 grit to clean up the surface. After remembering to wax the bucket, it was time for casting. However, the base ring was just a little bit on the small side. So much for me knowing the correct measurement. Because the resin-filled centre would be visible in the finished piece, it was important that it was positioned correctly, so using mixing sticks snapped in half, I wedged 4 bits equally spaced between the blank and the side of the bucket. As long as these stayed in place, everything would line up. I superglued a waste block to the blank. This was roughly in the centre and had 2 holes drilled in it, the idea being that I'll be able to use them to fill the centre void in the base. The resin is of course my usual preferred brand, mixed at a 2:1 ratio. In total I mixed 3 batches. The colour of choice was purple mica powder with no additional colourants. I used a heavy dose in each mix. I was hoping to get a pronounced marbled swirling effect in the finished bowl. With each one thoroughly mixed, I poured them into the casting. Filling the centre void using the small holes was a bit of a challenge, but I got there in the end. Once the batches were added, I considered mixing another one to raise the height a bit more, but I thought better of it. So with that done, I added some weight to hold everything in place and put it in the pressure pot. With the lid fastened down nice and tight, I added 50 to 55 psi and left it overnight to cure. It's the next day and the casting looks good, with a very heavy swirl pattern, which is what I wanted. But after removing the blank from the bucket, I could see that it had some voids that had formed on the joint between the wood and the resin. This has happened to me before, but there were no deep holes, so I wasn't too worried. I chiseled away the excess waste block, then I marked the centre at each end and drilled 2 holes, a deep one for the woodworm screw and a shallow one to locate the tailstock centre. I fixed the blank to the lathe and set to cutting a mortise, but first I had to level the base. Using a 3/8 bowl gouge, I shear scraped the resin down to the segmented ring, then I switched to the skew chisel to remove the heavier tool marks. To cut the mortise, I defined the outer edge with a 1/4 inch parting tool, cutting to a depth of around 8mm. Then I used the bowl gouge to remove most of the inner material, and I finished by cutting a dovetail with a dovetail cutter. That done, I turned the blank around so I could get on with levelling the top. This was so that I could get the top segmented ring epoxied in place. A final sanding with 80 grit to roughen the surface, and it was done. To position the ring, I used a drill bit in the centre hole and measured off it to the outer edge. Then I scratched the inner circle into the resin to give me a reference. Next, I mixed a small amount of resin, coloured the same as the rest, and used it to bond the segmented rim to the blank. A quick check with a tape measure, then I used hot melt glue to hold it in place. I poured the leftover resin in the centre to hopefully fill any gaps. This was then placed to one side and left to cure overnight. Whilst I had some time to kill, I decided to try something different for the lid. I mixed a full batch of resin, again coloured the same as the rest, and poured it into a 6-inch silicone baking mould. This was also left overnight to cure. Another day has passed and the segmented ring is well and truly bonded to the resin blank, and the lid blank has turned out quite nice as well. I fixed the bowl blank back on the lathe using a 4-jaw chuck, making sure it was centred and as balanced as possible. Then I drilled a new hole for the woodworm screw. That done, I turned the blank around, fixed the woodworm screw and held securely in place with a tailstock, again making sure it was as balanced and centred as possible. Having a well balanced blank, I was able to turn the speed up to around 1000 RPM, then I could begin turning. First up was the Easy Wood Tools full-size finisher. I used this to get down to the segmented rim. The resin was 2 days old, so it cut very easily. So easy in fact, I decided to switch to the 3/8 bowl gouge. I shear scraped what was left of the resin to reveal the segments, and having also cut away most of the voids, I turned my attention to the upper ring, which I'll call the rim from now on. Using the gouge to shear scrape, I got it more or less to round, then I began shaping the underside. I thought about creating an OG shape, but I wasn't sure, so whilst I thought about it, I began to form the cutout for the pedestal. The cutout didn't take long to get roughly to shape. Using the gouge to cut down into the base, I was seriously thinking about going deep enough to expose the purple resin in the centre, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it. Maybe next time. It was also at this point I noticed a resin-filled joint in the segments. I think this was probably one that didn't bond properly, because there were no gaps there before the casting. Moving back to the rim, I marked 2 lines to denote the start point of the upper and lower cut. Then using the gouge, I created a rough OG, but it didn't look right, so I shear scraped along with some push cuts to create a sweeping curve to blend the 2 pieces together, and to get closer to the finished surface, I used a full-size carbide to refine the shape. Happy the rim was more or less done, the cutout needed a bit of attention, and it's new tool time. This is a 1/2 inch detail spindle gouge. Using this I was able to cut down into the cutout, creating a much sharper transition between the upper and lower cut. It did a great job, and I have to say, I wish I'd bought this a long time ago. Using the gouge I reprofiled the base and thinned down the underside. I used a skew to blend and fare the resin into the lower ring, but the base was still a bit wide, so once that was reduced, I made a few more cuts to refine the shape, and apart from sanding and finishing, that was the outer surface done. Thinning the base down meant that the mortise had to be recut. This was done the same as before. Once the underside was level, I recut the mortise, added a dovetail, removed the excess, added a few decorative lines, and then I sanded all of the outer surface from 80 to 400 grit, continuing up to 3000 grit just on the resin. Sanding done, I cleaned down with denatured alcohol. Then I applied 2 coats of sanding sealer, each one denibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. The finish was only applied to the section below the rim. Next up, Yorkshire grit, a single coat, thoroughly cleaned away until no more residue is picking up on the paper towel. Then the resin polishing, starting with Merkur Polar Shine 10, just a single application, thoroughly cleaned away with more paper towel. This is quickly followed by Polar Shine 5, another single coat, polished off to leave a deep shine. And to finish, Hampshire Sheen Gloss Finishing Wax, 2 coats to seal and protect the surface. So the outside done, I turned the bowl around and began shaping the top of the rim. From the centre, I wanted a flat section for the lid to sit on, then a transition into a gentle concave curve downwards towards the rim. For this, I used the 1/2 inch bowl gouge, and feeling brave, I didn't use the tailstock, and of course I got a catch, which could have knocked the workpiece off the chuck, though thankfully that didn't happen, and after refixing the base and the 4-jaw chuck, I got back to it, though with the tailstock in place, just in case. And with the rim roughly to shape, I moved on to hollowing out. First off, I made the opening slightly wider. This also smoothed it out, preventing any catches. Then using the bowl gouge, I broke through the upper layer of resin, continuing on into the softwood waste block. But with restricted access, there was nothing else for it but to remove the tailstock. There was still a lot of weight in the blank, so I'd have to be careful. I cut down as far as I could with a gouge before switching to the side cutting scraper, but this was really digging in, so out came the full-size carbide. This has a negative rate cutter, so is much kinder when removing resin. Using a combination of the full-size and mid-size carbide, the side cutting scraper, and finishing with a large negative rate scraper, I gradually hollowed out the bowl. The process was fairly uneventful, and because most of the work is out of view, there's not a lot to see. With the last few passes from the negative rate scraper, the inside was done, so I moved on to the rim and cut in the recess for the lid to sit into. After levelling the top around the opening, I used the gouge to shear scrape it to open it up. Then I used the 1/4-inch parting tool to form the recess for the lid, and after some more shaping on the curved outer section, using the 1/2-inch bowl gouge in the scraper, the top and the inside of the bowl was ready for sanding, from 80 to 400 grit, then to 3000 grit on the resin. Sanding done, I applied the finish. First I cleaned down with denatured alcohol, then I applied 2 coats of sanding sealer, denibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad, then Yorkshire grit, thoroughly cleaned away, followed by the resin polishing. First, Mirka Polar Shine 10, then Polar Shine 5, and to finish, Hampshire Sheen Gloss Finishing Wax to seal and protect the surface. With the bowl done, I started on the lid. For this, as you saw earlier, I'd cast a solid piece of resin. To fix it to the lathe, I drilled a hole in the centre and screwed it onto a woodworm screw. First job was to get it around, then using a skew chisel, I cut the rebate round the edge. This would sit into the recess in the bowl. It took a couple of goes, but I got a good fit. Next, I flattened the outer edge and hollowed out the underside. The resin is quite heavy, so I wanted to remove as much as I could. I cut away most of it with a full-size carbide, finishing it off with a negative rate scraper. Then I sanded from 80 to 3000 grit. Then I applied the finish, or I should say, I polished it. After a clean with denatured alcohol, I applied Yorkshire grit, thoroughly cleaned away. Then I applied Polar Shine 10, followed by Polar Shine 5, which was polished off to leave a deep shine. To shape the top of the lid, I turned it around, fixed it to the lathe in the same way, then using the carbide cutter and the skew chisel, I formed a gentle curve from the centre down to the outer edge. Then this was also sanded from 80 to 3000 grit. Sanding done, this was finished in the same way as the underside. And to finish it off, the knob for the lid. This was made from African blackwood. First I used a spindle roughing gouge to get a section to round, and next I used a spindle gouge to form the shape I was looking for. Next the locating pin was cut using the gouge, then the parting tool to get it roughly to size. Then I refined the shape with a skew chisel before cutting the pin to size using the calipers set to 8mm as a guide. Then I parted it off and refixed it into the 4-jaw chuck so I could finish the top with a skew chisel. Then I sanded it to 400 grit and applied a wax finish. And that's it, another project finished. This was a great project to do. I sort of had an idea how it would look, but once finished, it turned out much better than I'd imagined. I like it a lot, and I hope you like it too. The purple marbled effect resin goes well against the lighter coloured ash, and the resin lid, well, that just adds to the overall look. That said, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Please subscribe, it will really help the channel grow. The thumbs up will be great, and comments are always welcome. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.